Story 1: The Uninvited Guest. Jessica had just moved into her first apartment, and the empty living room needed a cozy sofa. When she came across an ad on Craigslist for a sofa that seemed to fit perfectly, she was thrilled. The photos showed a pristine, elegant piece of furniture at a price that almost seemed too good to be true. However, the seller's email was mexicanpoppy666@hotmail.com, which Jessica found odd, but she decided to let it slide. Jessica hesitated but eventually emailed with her offer. The seller, a man named Luis, responded almost immediately, accepting her offer and asking for her address. Jessica felt uncomfortable with the request. She was wary of inviting a stranger into her home, so she offered to pick up the sofa instead. Luis repeatedly insisted that he would come to her house, which only made her more nervous. After a day of ignoring his persistent emails, Luis sent her his address. Jessica thought about the deal again, feeling torn between the deal and her growing anxiety. Despite the red flags, she decided to go through with it. She drove to the address Luis provided, a small, rundown house that seemed out of place among the well-maintained homes in the neighborhood. Her anxiety spiked as she noticed the unkempt yard and the poor condition of the house. Luis opened the door with a smile that was almost unnerving. He was a middle-aged man in a baseball cap, his demeanor friendly but unsettling. He invited Jessica inside, leading her to the living room where the sofa was supposed to be. However, the sofa was not as pristine as advertised. It had scratches and rips. The wear and tear was obvious. Jessica's disappointment was obvious. She brought up the discrepancies, and Luis, still keeping his annoyingly cheerful demeanor, offered a discount. "I don't care," Jessica replied firmly, eager to leave. As she headed for the door, Luis placed a hand on her shoulder, his smile never wavering. "If you give me something in return, I'll give you the couch for free," he said, his tone full of meaning. Repulsed, Jessica flinched and rushed out, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly drove back to her apartment, desperate to escape this unpleasant encounter. That night, as she lay in bed, the fear was creeping back in. Suddenly, she heard faint footsteps on the porch. Her heart raced as she turned off the TV and listened carefully. The noise grew louder, and she could hear someone fumbling with the front doorknob. Panicked, Jessica crept to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was in sight, but the noises continued. She picked up the phone and called 911. The dispatcher's calm voice was a small comfort as she heard the sound of her back gate opening and closing. Jessica yelled to whoever was outside that the police were on their way, hoping to scare them away. The noise stopped for a moment, only to start again with someone trying to open the back door. The intruder was gone by the time the police arrived, but the tension in Jessica's body did not subside. She believed Luis had been following her, and the thought of him lurking around her house was terrifying. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. Sleep had been elusive since then, and the fear of another unwanted guest haunted her every night. Story 2: The Stuffed Trap. John was looking for a birthday car for his son, and after a lot of searching, finally found a deal on Craigslist that seemed too good to pass up. The ad was for a 2003 Toyota Camry, boasting low miles and no accidents, for just $3,500. The seller, Bob, lived just 10 miles away. John excitedly contacted Bob and arranged to see the car, bringing the money he had saved with him. John arrived at Bob's house a little early. The house was isolated, located at the end of a dirt road with a large yard. The garage was open, revealing a bunch of car parts, but no sign of the Camry. There was only an old pickup truck parked outside. The sight of the messy garage and the absence of the advertised car made John uneasy. He approached the front door, noticing that the doorbell button was missing. He knocked for 5 minutes, growing increasingly anxious. There was no response and no sign of the car, so he decided to call Bob. From inside the house, he heard the faint ringing of a cell phone, confirming that Bob was indeed home but not answering the door. John looked through the window, trying to catch a glimpse inside. The house was dark, and he could see an old-fashioned dining table. Standing near the back door was a figure, motionless and unsettlingly still. John figured it must be Bob and decided to investigate further. Walking around the backyard, John made a horrifying discovery. The figure at the door was not Bob, but a stuffed human. The sight was horrifying, and the realization of what he was seeing made him feel sick. The lifelike appearance and eerie stillness of the figure made John's blood run cold. He ran back to the car, glancing back to see that the window blinds he had been peeking at were now crooked open. Someone, or something, was watching him. John's heart raced as he sped away, his mind reeling from the horrific encounter. He could only imagine the grisly intentions of whoever had staged such a gruesome display. The thought of being part of such a monstrous collection haunted him as he drove home, grateful to have escaped with his life. Story 3. The Pursuers. Mark had been eagerly looking for a good deal on a used iPhone 5 for weeks. When he found an ad on Craigslist offering one for a great price, he couldn't believe his luck. The seller claimed the phone was new and was upgrading to the newer iPhone 5. They agreed to meet in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot, a popular spot for Craigslist deals. Mark, who didn't know much about phones, brought his younger brother Dave along for the experience. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Mark and Dave arrived early. They waited, chatting casually about the new phone and how nice it was to finally get a good one for such a low price. Just then, a black Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot, and 2 large, intimidating men got out. One of them, the salesman, approached Mark and Dave, holding the iPhone 5 in his hand. The phone looked perfect, just as advertised. Dave examined it carefully, tested the functions, and made sure everything was working properly. Satisfied, he nodded in agreement with Mark. However, the salesman then asked for $250 instead of the agreed-upon $200. Mark was surprised but didn't want to ruin the deal, so he handed over $200, hoping to negotiate the remaining amount. The salesman's expression changed slightly, showing his displeasure, but he accepted the lower price and walked back to his car with his companion. Mark and Dave, relieved to have completed the purchase, got into their car. As they drove away, Mark glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed a black Honda Civic following. At first, Mark thought it was a coincidence. However, as they turned onto different streets, the Civic remained right behind them, maintaining a consistent distance. Dave, noticing the same thing, suggested that they stop and check for problems. Mark, feeling a little nervous, was reluctant, but eventually agreed that they needed to be cautious. The Civic's presence was unnerving. Every time Mark turned, the car followed them closely. The men in the Civic did not seem to be in a hurry, nor did they try to pass them. They just followed closely. Mark's anxiety grew as he realized that they had been traveling the same route for far too long. It was clear that they were not just following him casually, but were deliberately tracking his movements. Desperate to escape their pursuit, Mark began driving aggressively. He sped up, made sharp turns, and ran red lights, trying to get away from the Civic. Dave's anxiety mirrored his own. He gripped the dashboard and watched the Civic's headlights in the rearview mirror, each second feeling like a century. Mark's heart pounded as he maneuvered through the streets, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The Civic kept pace with them, never faltering no matter how erratically Mark drove. His attempts to evade them were futile, and the realization that he might not be able to escape them made him break out in a sweat of fear. It was as if the Civic was determined to pursue them no matter what. In a final, desperate move, Mark spotted an intersection ahead with a red light. When the light turned red, he slammed on the gas, accelerating through the intersection before any of the other cars had a chance to pass. The Civic hesitated for a moment before accelerating, but Mark's lead was enough to create a gap. He glanced back and saw the Civic falter, eventually losing sight of them. Panting, Mark drove home with a growing sense of urgency. The drive seemed endless, the darkness of the night heightening his fear. As he neared his house, he noticed the Civic parked across the street, its headlights off. Panic welled up inside him again. Mark pulled into the driveway and immediately woke his father, who was fast asleep. Mark frantically recounted the entire situation, how they had been followed, how he had managed to elude his pursuers, and how the Civic was now parked outside their house. His father, a man of action, grabbed a baseball bat and stood behind the front door, ready to protect his family. The air was tense as they waited in the dark house. Footsteps approached the front door. Mark's father stood silent, bat clutched in his hand. Then, without warning, there was a loud bang, a gunshot through the door, inches from where Mark's father stood. The sound was deafening and terrifying. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he and his father listened to the commotion outside. They could hear Joe, a police officer who lived 2 doors down and whom Mark had called for help, shouting orders at the men. The scuffles and yelling grew louder before the door swung open and Joe entered, quickly followed by more police officers. The 2 men from Civic were subdued and taken into custody, their intentions finally revealed. They were armed and ready to use their weapons to intimidate or worse. Mark's father went outside to help Joe, who tried to protect the men and arrest them. The confrontation was over, but the shock and fear were still evident. The incident left Mark and his family shaken. They were relieved to be safe, but haunted by the thought of what could have happened if they had not escaped the dangerous situation. The sight of the black Honda Civic parked across the street will forever be a reminder of the night they narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter.